Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. This one, written by Danny, read by me. I'm Simon, you probably know that. The Curious Case of the Vanishing Actress and the Sinister Skeleton. Nice title. Not sure if that will remain the title on YouTube, but I like the word Sinister Skeleton. One of my first things on YouTube that I was like, oh no, what a terrible mistake that everyone was just reaming me for, was there was a video I made and I said skeleton rather than skeleton. And everyone was like, skeleton? What are you talking about? What's a skeleton? And I just, who knew it was actually not got a G in there? Today I found out. The format of the show, Danny writes it for me. I've never read it before. Let's get into it. When the police were called in to poke around an old neglected cottage in a small English village in 1949, they probably weren't expecting to find very much of interest. The last known owner of the cottage had been a lady by the name of Constance Kent, who had apparently been something of a theatre star after the turn of the century, before retiring and retreating into a life of solitude. But she'd gone missing without a trace a whole 10 years earlier, and she certainly wasn't expected to suddenly turn up now where she disappeared and people just left her house there. It's got to be so great. Can you imagine just a house frozen in time from like 10 years ago? You just go in there, be like some iPhone 5 or whatever on the table. You'd be like, whoa, still works. Suspicious activity had led the police back to the cottage in 1949, where a somewhat gruesome discovery was made. Yet it was a discovery which may have thrown up more questions than answers. And not everyone could even agree on what exactly had been found lurking silently in the upstairs bedroom. Let me guess, Danny, a skeleton. It was a discovery which didn't appear to make any sense. A situation not held by conflicting press reports which were painting a pretty hazy picture of events, even as they were unfolding. What? The press? The news media? Presenting a hazy picture of events based on half-truths? What? Never. No way. We could be talking about a myth, a murder, a double murder, a hoax, a staggering coincidence, or something else entirely taking place in a sleepy English village with the rather unfortunate name of Fingringhoe. Really? Where is Fingringhoe? I gotta look this up. Do you think it's still called that, or did they change it? Like, I feel like they changed things because, like, no one wants to be living in a village called Ho. No, it's a place. It exists. It's a tiny village in near somewhere called Colchester. There's St Andrew's Church. There's the Whalebone, a lovely pub, 4.4. Google Maps. No one cares. God, it really is in the middle of nowhere. Colchester, a reasonable sized town, is quite nearby. This is in the north, right? Yeah. I mean, north. It's like, it's below Cambridge. Okay, so not really in the north. It's in the south, but it's above London. So the north to me. Just before we continue with today's episode, I do want to talk about something important, and that's your personal data, dear listener. Did you know that data breaches have increased by nearly 41.5% from 2021? That's just 3 years ago. That's a huge jump. It's almost as bad as inflation these days. Hey, economics joke. Oh, God. It's scary how easily your information can end up in the wrong hands. That's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Incogni is an amazing service that protects your personal data from data brokers. These brokers collect and sell your information. Names, social security numbers, home addresses, you name it, they sell it. If you get a flood of robocalls, it's possible your phone number has been sold. Thankfully, you can limit that with Incogni. They contact the data brokers on your behalf and get that info removed. It's super simple to use. You create an account, you tell them what data you want removed, and then you grant them the right to work for you. Boom. You sit back, relax. They'll handle everything. They'll check back with the data brokers, make sure it's removed, and deal with any objections. It's that easy. So if you want to take back control of your personal data, try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. Use the code UNKNOWN at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/unknown. Protect your privacy in 3 easy steps. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring. And now back to it. But can any of that provide any fresh clues as to the ultimate fate of Constance Kent? Well, take your seats, already sitting, as we prepare to raise the curtain and separate fact from fiction on our quest to solve the curious case of the vanishing actress and the sinister skeleton. Nah, just joking, I know it's skeleton. I had that beaten over my head. I recently found out, like, my whole life, I was saying coup de grace, you know? Like, to swiftly attack, you know? Sorry, not coup de, that's a coup de main. Coup de grace. Like, the final blow. Like, to deliver the final blow. I thought it was coup de grace my whole life. And then, people in the latest comments said, you mean coup de grace? And I'm like, no, I mean coup de grace. It's French. And I looked it up and it's totally coup de grace. I was even like so sure of this. I was like, I was on the phone with my dad and I'm like, Dad, how do you say the French for like the final blow? Like the coup de, and he's like, coup de grace. And I'm like, right. But no, he was also wrong.
Oh.
Act 1, Waiting in the Wings. Even the beginning of our story is buried in mystery, as it has to be said that Ada Constance Kent, better known to her friends, or at least her acquaintances, as Connie, was a bit of an enigma in herself. We don't even know what she looked like, although some online reports in the case depict photographs of a young actress at around the beginning of the 20th century, but they just seem to be generic photographs from the era with no credible sources. I realise that I might have just made the editor's job very difficult now, so I probably shouldn't have mentioned it. Just mid-journey. Create an image of a generic actress. Boom! This will be our... What was her name? Ada? This will be Ada. If you want, editor, I don't. That's your job. Just carry on. Maybe we'll just have to stick with generic images in lieu of anything more concrete. Yeah, I feel like it's like, Simon, why can't you show images of that? Why is there no video footage of that? And I was like, well, I can't. Like, sometimes you just can't get the copy. Like, often it's like police images and stuff for like this or Decoding the Unearth or Casual Criminalist. But sometimes it's like, I just can't use that image. It's not allowed. It's not allowed. And it's like, I'm not going to pay like $400 to license it or whatever for one little thing. No, sorry. Try and enjoy the show anyway. Although if it's any help, I'd like to think she had a bulbous nose, a cupped ear, and a mohawk hairdo. Mid-journey! It's believed that Connie was born around 1871 in the village of Fingringhoe in the city of Colchester, district of Essex, county of Essex. Isn't Essex a county? Between London and the North Sea. She apparently later moved to London after finding some degree of fame as an actress. In fact, it's widely reported that she was a moderately successful star of both the stage and screen during her heyday in the limelight. It's interesting how she's obviously I guess making a living doing this, but we just don't really have any records of her. And she was probably like a little bit famous back in her time. It's like in 100 years. People are like, Simon, who? Who?
Who is that?
Because it's, you're just a little bit famous. You make your living doing it. And it's like, no one will remember you. Everyone will be forgotten. Even Julius Caesar. He'll eventually be forgotten. Oh, the existential dread. But there's already a bit of confusion here, as nobody has ever dug up any concrete information on the glittering career of this supposedly moderately successful star. Perhaps some of this confusion arose from the fact that she performed under the stage name of Vera Vachale rather than her real name. And there's a very good reason why Ada Constance Kent may have felt reluctant to use her real name in film credits and theatre bills. The name Constance Kent is more frequently associated with the British woman who confessed the savage murder of her own 3-year-old half-brother in 1860 when she was 16. If that's famous, why would you call your kids that same name? Who is that? What's that famous? Like, it'd be like, oh, your surname's Savile. Well, we're just going to call you James. Maybe Jimmy for short. No one would do that. It's only 20-something years after this happened. Why would you name your kid after what? No. That's an incredibly intriguing story in itself, in which all may not be quite as it seemed, but I'll not go into any more detail, as it might make a good pitch for Casual Criminalist one day. Go for it, Danny. Just do it. But the point is that our Constance Kent from Fingringhoe might not have made it very far in the world of show business if she was using her real name, shared with a recently convicted murderer. Come to think of it, I find it bizarre that she was even given such a notorious name at the time of her birth in 1871. Exactly. It's like James Savile. Don't. No. Oh, your surname's Glitter? That wasn't Gary Glitter's real name. What was it? I don't even remember was his real name Glitter? It's like, yeah, we'll call you Gaz. No. Considering that the sickening news of the murder and subsequent conviction would have still been fresh in the minds of the British public. The modern-day equivalent would be please say it's Savile. Tell me you use it, Savile. Taking the name of your kid, either Harold Shipman, Rose West, or Gary Glitter. Yes! Either way, that kid's going to have a tough time at school. Oh, hi, Harry. Harry Shipman. Leave me alone. However, even if we take into consideration that Ada Constance Kent may have acted under the rather more palatable stage name of Vera Vachale, there's still not a single credit to be found anywhere under either name or even slight variations on either name during the period. You'd think that a moderately successful movie star would have at least garnered a single credit on IMDb. I mean, people get credits on IMDb for just playing parts such as bearded man at bus stop in a wiped movie from 1898. Yeah, I've even got IMDb credits. You go on there and it's like Simon Whistler, host of the TV show Decoding the Unknown. I'm like, whoa. Steady, IMDb. Don't give me too much credit. And I don't know who does these. I don't know who adds to IMDb. It's not me. That would be weird. It's still weird. It's not a TV show. It's a YouTube channel. Chill out, IMDb. Even I've got credits on an IMDb and I don't get recognized at family gatherings. Oh, Danny also, as like writer, of course. There's actually another actress listed on IMDb who again curiously went by the name of Constance Kent, but she was still very young when she played a handful of roles in the 1930s, which would have been long after Connie retired, so it seems that Connie never actually appeared on the screen unless she went by another name of which nobody is aware. It's more likely that her modest acting career was confined to the theatre, but there are a few question marks over this as well. Theatre plays were heavily promoted and reviewed in detail in the British press at the turn of the 20th century, and again, nobody has ever found a single mention of either Ada Constance Kent or Vera Vashale. Yeah, but I mean, so if she wasn't like the leading role, she'd maybe be like, what was he saying, bearded man number 10 or whatever, on the stage. So it's like, yeah, you're a working actor, but kinda not. That doesn't necessarily indicate that she wasn't really an actress at all. Maybe she only ever worked over at the other side of the world. The Australian press took an unusually high level of interest in the later unfolding story of the vanishing actress, and it's not entirely clear why. To be fair, the story attracted a fair bit of other international interest, which you might expect anyway from something that evolved into a kooky horror tale. But the Australian press often gave more detailed and accurate coverage than the British newspapers, which perhaps indicates that Connie was a bit better known down under. We'll return to Connie's elusive early life shortly, but for now let's jump into the latter stages of her life, in which the details and evidence are a lot more clearly defined. By the 1930s, Connie Kent was in her 60s and had retired from a potentially glamorous, if largely forgotten, career to return to her roots in Fingringhoe, a fascinating Old English village steeped in rich history. Danny, I just looked it up. It's got like one pub. It's barely a hamlet, Danny. Well, I say it's a fascinating Old English village. According to travel brochures, it's famous for having a duck pond and a red telephone box. Oh my god, who cares? It's like, I've lived in some fairly boring places in the UK, and it's like, just don't come here. It's a tiny English village. No one's coming there. Why would you come here? A far more importance, it regularly pops up in lists of the UK's rudest place names, right up there with Shitterton, Wet Wang, Bell End, Titty Hill, Broken Wind, and Sandy Balls. These are all real places. No! Titty Hill! And it was in this quaint village of Fingringhoe that Connie settled down to enjoy her retirement in a charming 3-bedroom cottage in Whalebone Corner on the main road right next to the primary school and just around the corner from that famous duck pond. Also, the name of the pub was the Whalebone. I know way too much about Fingringhoe. It was a bit of a walk to the equally famous red telephone box, but you can't have everything. It'd be nice to think that Connie was a popular member of the local community who got on famously with anybody, but in fact, she was seen as a bit of a grumpy old goat who rarely mixed with the other natives. She lived alone for the rest of her life and preferred quiet solitude over the prospect of exchanging idle gossip with her neighbours. I'm like, yes, that sounds better. Like, just like, I don't care, just want to be left alone. Oh, I'm such a loser. If you saw her out and about, she was most likely just nipping into the village pub, the Whalebone, there we go, still there today, for a quick drink on her own, taking the opportunity to pick up a packet of 20 Woodbines whilst she was there. Is that some sort of old school cigarette? Woodbines. But she was unlikely to have accepted an invitation to sign up for the village darts team. The residents of the village most likely to experience regular encounters with Connie were the kids in the school playground next door, who would regularly get told to piss off if they ever dared to venture too close to the cottage. Whilst most villagers remember Connie as being cold, bad-tempered, and thoroughly unapproachable, she was known to have at least one female friend by the name of Mrs. Maskell, who lived in a different village in the Colchester district, and she was known to employ the services of a gardener and handyman called George Winkle. I'm already like, George murdered someone. That's all I know about George, but I'm like, why is he coming up in this story? He's gonna murder someone, I can just tell. Allegedly. Who lived just around, he's definitely dead. We don't need to say allegedly. These people are all dead. Long dead. Who lived just around the corner, although it's not clear how often he popped round to the cottage, or if they were friends as such. Poor old George certainly seemed to take the later disappearance of his client quite badly, as we'll later discover. But another little puzzle here is that a couple of residents recall that Connie Kent occasionally used to leave the village for weeks at a time, but nobody was sure exactly where she went. Maybe Australia. She could, of course, been enjoying extended visits to her family, although it's not clear if she even had any surviving family members, or perhaps she wasn't quite as retired as we thought, and she still had work to attend to in London or overseas. But all of this made it quite tricky to spot that Ada Constance Kent had gone missing in March 1939. Wait, I can't believe that someone goes missing for 10 years. I just don't... Someone's going to be like, oh, where's that old lady? Should we get the police around to ours? I haven't seen her in a while. And like, her car's in the drive, and now all the tyres are flat. You know? Here we have a reclusive 68-year-old woman who lived alone, didn't seem to enjoy company, and often went away for quite long periods without telling anybody where she was going. It's little wonder that it took approximately 3 months before anyone started wondering what happened to Connie Kent. Yeah, well, 3 months is a lot more believable than 10 years. Didn't we say, it was 10 years before people, went into a house and were like, hello? Oh, there's bones in the bed. Act 2. Breaking out of character. The last confirmed sighting of Connie was down at the Whalebone pub in early March 1959 when the landlord, Alfred J. Hassler, served her with a quick drink and her usual packet of 20 woodbines. The landlord later noted that she looked quite ill and seemed to have developed a nasty cough, but he didn't make much of it at the time and didn't bother to try and strike up any meaningful conversation with her. That might seem a bit ignorant for a jolly pub landlord, but as he later publicly observed, she didn't mix with other people. Well, yeah, also you're, as a pub landlord, it's most, come in. If people want to have a chat with them. But if they don't want to have a chat, then it's your kind of job to know that they don't want to be having a chat with you. So you just shut up and serve them a beer, right?
Right.
It was supposedly her friend, Mrs. Maskill, who first noticed that Connie had disappeared after 3 months. But although she reported the matter to the police, not an awful lot seemed to happen until another 3 months had passed when the gardener, George Winkle, finally seemed to realise that he hadn't trimmed his client's bush for quite some time. Danny, why? A police constable was dispatched to the cottage with the rather fitting name of Bernard Constable, really? Which made him officially a Constable. Major. Accompanied by George Winkle, Constable investigated the old cottage at Whalebone Cottage around September 1939, when the gardener and the constable may have had a couple of other things on their minds, considering that the Second World War had just broken out. Oh yeah, 1939, okay. Gaining access into the cottage wasn't too difficult as the door was unlocked, which was obviously a worrying sign. And there were more worrying signs to be found inside, like a skeleton. I don't know, maybe. A supper tray had been placed on top of the dining table with the remains of a meal sitting on top of it. Connie's coat was on the hook, her spectacles were still on the mantelpiece, her personal belongings were scattered around the house, including books and picture postcards and trinkets and a large collection of unusual fabrics, whilst a well-thumbed copy of Romeo and Juliet was lying open on a chair by the fireplace. There was no sign of Connie Kent. The relatively neat and tidy state of the house did not seem to indicate that any kind of disturbance or violent incident had taken place. No, isn't everyone assuming that she just died in her sleep or whatever? At this point, you'd be like, she's 68 years old, so she's not young. And she had that cough, and she's not been seen. It's like she probably just died in her sleep and no one's gone to check out on her yet. You're like, what's that? Is that Connie I smell? Is that her rotting body? But it also seemed alarmingly unlikely that Connie had gone away on a perfectly innocent long trip after leaving food on the table, her spectacles on the mantelpiece, her coat on the hook, and the cottage door completely unlocked. It felt more like she'd either made a very sudden and rushed departure, or she'd just vanished into thin air. And the village of Fingringhoe would sadly never again respond to a cheerful, neighbourly wave from Ada Constance Kent, or at least they would never again be at the wrong end of a withering glare that could turn milk sour. Despite this natural concern, nothing was really followed up for another 10 years. This may have been partly because no family or friends had actively pursued the disappearance, partly because no crime appeared to have been committed, and also partly because everybody would generally be quite busy with other things over the subsequent 6 years of World War II. Some grumpy old lady going for a walkabout without leaving a forwarding address wouldn't have been viewed as a top priority back then. George Winkle did pop round for another look around the empty cottage 3 years later in 1942, breaking through the front door which had been secured by the police after the initial investigation. Okay. I thought they'd find her skeleton because it's called Skeleton, and I just assumed she'd died in the house. Maybe she died in the garden, and now she's it's been grown over, like her skeleton is in the garden and there's bushes around it. That seems like, I don't think... That seems like the most likely explanation, right? Just completely innocent natural causes. Except the gardener George probably murdered her, in my opinion. But all he found was a slightly dirtier version of the same scene as before, with all of Connie's belongings, including that open copy of Romeo and Juliet, now coated in thick layers of dust. Even the supper tray had been left on the table, though I doubt George would have been tempted to polish off the remains by this stage. He conducted another comprehensive search of the cottage, perhaps even delving deeper than the original search with Constable, as he reckons he opened every cupboard and checked underneath every piece of furniture. But he still couldn't dig up any fresh clues as to what had happened to his former client and possibly friend. It wasn't until 1949 that the police returned to the cottage for another nosy around. It's 9 years later! 10 years later! What? Why? Why is this still here? Hasn't this been claimed by someone and sold off? And their reason for a second visit was quite a curious one. Apparently, somebody had been regularly placing substantial deposits into Connie Kent's bank accounts throughout the previous 10 years. the last one being made towards the close of 1948. The bank hadn't been able to contact their customer since she disappeared in 1939, and they weren't quite sure what they were supposed to do with all the money that had continued to grow since Connie fell off the radar. So they contacted the local police to inquire if they could shed any light on the official whereabouts of this missing person, and at least ascertain whether their customer was deemed to be dead or alive. And this time, the police found a lot more than they bargained for down at the cottage at Wellburn Corner. According to the majority of contemporary newspaper reports, the abandoned old cottage was still in a similar condition to how it had been left a decade earlier, although it was now in dire need of a proper good vacuum and the installation of a few air fresheners. I feel like after that amount of time, that food has rotted away to the point where you don't smell it anymore. It's just completely gone. It would smell bad for a while, and then it would smell okay. There was no mention of Romeo and Juliet this time around, and the supper tray also thankfully appears to have finally disappeared. But now there are a couple of other things in the cottage which hadn't been spotted on any of the previous investigations. For starters, there was an empty glass bottle clearly marked poison sitting on a bedside table. And more disturbingly, just a few feet away from the bed and the empty bottle of poison, the police found a fully dressed human skeleton on the floor, staring vacantly upward at the unexpected visitors. That's surely not the kind of thing either George Winkle or Constable would have missed during their searches of the property, unless they were both suffering from serious problems with their concentration. They'd both have to have, brain tumors or be high as or something to miss that fully dressed skeleton on the floor. Now, one fairly natural assumption to make here is that Connie Kent did eventually make her way back to her cottage in Fingringhoe, but died some years later after George searched the house in 1942. She possibly took her own life, judging by the empty poison bottle on the bedside table, but at least it looked like she managed to put away the supper tray and finish off Romeo and Juliet before she popped her clogs. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Wherever she was, bit of a mystery, but she came back, and she killed herself in her house, for whatever reason. Where did she go? Great question. However, it seems a bit unlikely that absolutely nobody in Fingringhoe witnessed the surprise return of the missing, presumed dead Connie Kent after an absence of several years. You would have expected her at least to pop down to the whalebone to pick up another packet of 20 woodbines. Nevertheless, these were the assumptions made by Scotland Yard, and these were the conclusions initially reported in the press. But there was to be an unexpected twist to the tale, which was later reported in a whole bundle of British and international newspapers, including most notably the Chelmsford Chronicle, which dived into the most detail. A forensic expert at Scotland Yard revealed that the human skeleton was not the remains of Ada Constance, after all. The skeleton was deemed to be too large and more likely belonged to a younger male. And this just throws up a whole bunch of new riddles to wrap around that enigma. If this wasn't the skeleton of the missing Connie Kent, then who the devil was it? And why were they in their abandoned cottage? Why hadn't it been spotted during the early investigations? What had happened to the real Ada Constance Kent? And why had she made such a hurried departure 10 years earlier? I think, someone broke into a house and killed themselves by drinking the poison, or whatever. Seems definitely possible. Why was a missing presumed dead person still receiving regular substantial payments into a bank account despite not having used it or been seen since 1939? Was there any connection between the former actress and the skeletal remains found in the cottage, and could they both have been murdered by the same wicked hands? And most importantly of all, what happened to that copy of Romeo and Juliet? Act 3. Chewing the scenery. One of the most frustrating aspects of this story is the manner in which the contemporary news reports were so contradictory in all sorts of ways, even on the very same day. Whilst one paper was telling you that the body of Ada Constance Kent had finally been found, another paper was telling you that an entirely different murder victim had recently been dumped in her cottage, whilst another paper was telling you that the skeletons were rising from the cemetery and terrorizing the schoolchildren of Fingringhoe, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. That'd be the daily... What's that paper that makes stuff up? Is it the Sport? There's some paper where it's just outrageous headlines that are basically unbelievable, because they aren't not believable because they're not real. The skeleton is a good case in point. Just about all the press reports describe the skeleton as being fully dressed, which kind of makes it sound as if some prankster had dressed the skeleton in a nice smoking jacket and perched it on a chair with a pipe casually hanging out of its mouth. Nah, to me, it sounds like someone died in their clothes and all their flesh rotted away and their clothes are still there because they're made out of polyester or something. At one extreme, some reports did indeed seem to make out that the skeleton was slouching comfortably on a chair, as if it were wondering what all the fuss was about. At the other extreme, the South Bend Tribune, based in Indiana... Wait, in America? Painted it... How's this an international story? Painted a very is there another Indiana that I just don't know of in the UK? Painted a very different picture of disconnected bones being found under the bed, which were put together to form a complete human skeleton. However, the majority of contemporary reports agreed that a largely complete human skeleton was found lying on the floor near the bed, still draped in the simple clothes it had presumably been wearing at the point of death, and which were now probably in need of a bit of a wash. But whilst these early news reports were frustrating enough, the story only became ever more confusing in later online variations of the tale. A quick search on Google throws up a bunch of results on the first few pages which fail to convey the true picture, and they source much of their information from the Unsolved Mysteries wiki, which appears to be guilty of just blatantly making it up. What? The Unsolved Mysteries wiki? Come on now, don't be ridiculous, Danny. They would never make things up. No one in that entire community would ever make anything up or embellish things. Come on. That's not to say that everything we've discussed so far turned out to be total bollocks from start to finish. Far more than just the bare bones of this tale are completely true. It's just some of the important details that need a closer examination with a pastry brush. That being said, that might be reassuring to hear, as when I first began to wade through all the crap while researching this story, I was beginning to wonder if Ada Constance Kent even existed in the first place. It seems baffling that the legacy of a supposed moderately successful star of the theatre has been completely erased from history. Well, thanks to the sterling work conducted by writer and rummager Helen Barrell, it would appear that she very much did exist. Although no birth records exist of Constance Kent born in Fingringhoe during this period, Helen was able to dig up a census from 1881, which reveals that a 10-year-old Constance Kent was indeed born in the village and later moved nearby to the heart of the city of Colchester with a 34-year-old tailor machinist by the name of Helen Ann Kent, who was presumably her mother, and a 58-year-old widow named Mary Ann Kent, who was presumably her grandmother. The trio popped up again in 1891 in a census when Connie would have been around 20 years old, but after this she completely falls off the grid and never makes it onto a census again. I found so many old censuses of my family because I was doing the, I think we had Ancestry, or I think it was Ancestry as a sponsor, and I was like going back through all the records, and I found like the address where my family, like my great-great-grandfather lived, and then the names of the kids and people who lived in his house and what they did, and it's like all handwritten, and it says like confidential on it, but obviously it's well out of date. So it's like, it's interesting stuff. I find this fascinating. I know some people find it very boring, so I'll just carry on. One might presume from that she died tragically young, but there is another potential explanation for her early disappearance. We've already speculated that Connie may have moved overseas as she began to carve out a new career in show business, and this would certainly tie in neatly with her age at the time. Helen Barrell was unable to find any travel or emigration records connected to Constance Kent or her stage name Vera Vashale to confirm this, but it still can't be ruled out. Another theory is that Connie may have been a young suffragette who refused to participate in the census until women were finally given the right to vote. This was a fairly common form of protest back in the day, with the idea being that if a woman couldn't be trusted to vote, then they weren't prepared to have their names appear on a silly official register either. This obviously wouldn't have been a problem in later years after women finally won the right to vote. In fact, participating in the census during the Second World War would have been a central survival move, as you wouldn't have been granted a ration book if your name didn't appear on the register. But it's possible that Connie was still working abroad until the 1930s when she moved back to Fingringhoe and sadly didn't stick around for long enough to make it onto the next census and claim her ration book. Come to think of it, if an actress was destined to disappear at any time during the 20th century, then directly before the outbreak of the Second World War wouldn't have been a bad time to make an exit pursued by a bear. The idea that Connie was a suffragette is quite a popular one, with many theorists pointing out that she was brought up in a household consisting exclusively of women and remained single for the rest of her life. I'm not convinced that this is proof that she was the type of woman who chose to chain herself to the railings of the Houses of Parliament on a regular basis. Did you have to do that to be a suffragette? Was suffragette actually being a part of like a physical movement, or was it just supporting that movement? There's an unpleasant implication here that she hated men, whereas from what we know of Connie Kent, I think it's more likely that she just hated everybody. But of course, there's no reason to suggest why she wouldn't be one of the 50,000 women dedicated to the cause at the time. And whilst we can't be sure of the exact reasons why she disappeared from census records so early, we do know for sure that she was born in 1871 in Fingringhoe and wasn't anywhere to be seen at all after 1939. There's another very early little newspaper clipping from 1883 which may shed a bit more light on the mysterious career of Connie and how everyone may have gotten the wrong end of the stick. It's a brief piece plucked from the pages of the Colchester Gazette, which covers the 1883 Essex Agricultural Show. Fascinating stuff. The article reveals these local newspapers, man. It's like just such boring stories. Ah, yes, the Essex Agricultural Show.
Boring!
The article reveals that a 12-year-old girl by the name of Ada Constance Kent won second prize in a doll dressing competition. Now, that might not tell us much on first glance, or second glance to be fair, but could this be a clue that whilst Connie's career was very much rooted in show business, she was actually working as a costume maker rather than an actress? Bit of a... Come on. She's 12 years old, she wins a competition. I don't know what competitions I won as a 12-year-old. Oh, I know. I want a photography competition. Am I a photographer? No. It might seem like a bit of a leap to make from one newspaper cutting, indeed, Danny, but hang on a second. Connie's presumed mother was a tailor machinist, so she may have learned some tailoring skills from childhood, and she certainly displayed some kind of aptitude for dressing dolls, even if she only came second at the 1883 Essex Agricultural Show. But not only that, it was often noted after her disappearance that her abandoned cottage was still heaving with an unusually large collection of fabric, silks, and furs. The searchers of the cottage also apparently uncovered several letters and documents addressed to her stage name of Via River Shale, though the contents of those documents were never made public. I mean, people have hobbies. Like, my nan was into, making carpets and, sewing and doing all of these complicated things. But, that doesn't mean she was I want to say carpenter, but that's not the right word. Like a rug maker or whatever. But whilst most people have assumed that this was a stage name for an actress, it could have just been the case that she worked under a different professional name to avoid any association with that recently convicted child slayer. It's just a theory, of course, but all those fabrics and silks found in her home do seem to suggest that dressmaking may have been more than just a private hobby. It perhaps also suggests that she was still reasonably active in her work, and this was why she occasionally left town for longer periods. It would also certainly explain why nobody can dig up any information relating to a moderately successful theatre career, as we were never talking about an actress taking centre stage here. We're talking about a seamstress working quietly behind the scenes. It's unlikely that we'll ever have this confirmed, but at least we can feel pretty confident that Connie Kent was very much born in Fingringhoe and was last seen alive in Fingringhoe, even if a mystery may still linger over exactly how she filled her time in between. But if that fully dressed skeleton found in the cottage belonged to a different character entirely, then we still have to figure out what happened to Connie after she was last spotted picking up her final packet of woodbines. Also, we have to figure out who that skeleton belonged to. Why is there a random young man skeleton in a house? What's going on? Act 4. Them Bones. The fact that Connie Kent appeared to have left the cottage so suddenly without even bothering to lock the door suggests that her departure wasn't planned, and that could suggest that she met with a terrible accident, or if we're feeling dramatic, that she was murdered, or if we're feeling really dramatic, that she was the victim in a double murder. Okay, gonna need to see some evidence for that though, Danster. The fact that a skeleton seemingly just popped up out of nowhere in the cottage years after the owner disappeared seems to suggest that something slightly sinister took place at some point in the cottage at Whalebone Corner. Yeah, if there's a skeleton lying on the floor, something weird happened there. Like, slightly sinister, maybe they poisoned themselves. More sinister, they were murdered. More sinister still, double murder. And yet there had never been any sign of disturbance during the initial investigations, and any question of even a bungled robbery had been ruled out, as there was no evidence of a break-in, and there was still plenty of jewelry, cash, and other items left behind in the cottage. How has this place not been robbed and vandalized? I feel like if this was taking place in the present day, that everything of value would have been stripped out of there within years, because the police state would go up, no one would go to renew it. It would just be an abandoned house. Some youths would go in and steal all the, and then soon after that all the windows would be broken. Soon after that the floorboards would be ripped up and the wiring ripped out of the walls and graffiti sprayed everywhere. How is this all just still there? Just cash hanging out in some abandoned house? But perhaps there was no connection whatsoever between the disappearance of Connie Kent and the mysterious skeletal visitor found in her bedroom. Connie may have just been the victim of a tragic accident, and the whole skeleton thing was something else entirely that just happened to take place in the home that she left behind. Yeah, is it so crazy to think that someone broke into her house, like some homeless person was just living there, and then they decided to poison themselves to death? That doesn't seem unreasonable. Some residents at the time recall that she often used to go out for late-night walks on her own. It's reported that the water board was installing new pipes by the cemetery during the time that Connie was last spotted, so maybe she just carelessly fell down a hole in the dark, although you would have expected the body to turn up fairly soon afterwards. Alternatively, maybe she just slipped and fell into Fingringhoe's celebrated duck ponds during one of her late-night walkabouts. This was very close to her home, and her body was unlikely to be found at the time unless somebody was specifically looking for it. According to a report in The Guardian in 1949, this very thought crossed the mind of the police after the skeleton was found 10 years later. Yet despite The Guardian's confident headline, "Pond to be dredged," it looks as if this never happened, and the police later denied that they ever had any intention of doing so. Even The Guardian was like this in the past. Just hey, yeah, that's good, that's a clickbaity headline, isn't it? Woo! Another theory is that Connie Kent took her own life, although this largely seems to be based around the discovery of the empty poison bottle, which of course was found very close to the skeleton rather than Connie herself. In fact, the empty bottle of poison was found so close to the body of the skeleton that it's enough to make you think that the scene discovered in 1949 might have been dramatically staged for one reason or another. It's almost like a scene from one of Shakespeare's darker plays. Oh wait, hang on a moment. There were so many references to the copy of Romeo and Juliet lying open on a bedside table during the initial investigations. Just a quick spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't got round to reading this 427-year-old play, it ends on a bit of a downer, with Juliet finally stabbing herself after discovering that Romeo is dead after he downed a whole bottle of poison. Does anyone need to? It's Romeo and Juliet. It's literally one of those famous stories ever told. It's almost, but not quite as grim as the closing scenes of the legendary BBC sci-fi series Blake 7, shown in 1981. What are you talking about? I know Simon won't be aware of this, but anyone who saw it as a child will remember the trauma and grief. I gotta know now. What is Blake 7 and how does it end? Blake's 7 ending. Okay, let's find out. Avon finds Blake and, suspecting him of betraying the group, kills him. Oh no, Blake, the main guy. No, Blake. Oh wow, this is some old school sci-fi. This looks quite bad. Sorry, Danny, this does look quite bad. But it just seems a bit fishy that during the latest search of 1949, the copy of Romeo and Juliet on the bedside table had been replaced with an empty bottle of poison, almost as if somebody was paying a slow-burning homage to the play. Could it have been a hoax scene set up by a village joker? I mean, pretty extreme joker, getting an actual skeleton. Could Connie Kent have later returned to the cottage to fake her own death in a typically dramatic style for someone with a background in the theatre? Or perhaps it was all a cunning ploy from a murderer with a different body to hide. If such a murderer dumped this new body and an empty bottle of poison in a cottage belonging to a woman who had vanished years earlier, it might be quickly assumed years later by busy or lazy people that Connie Kent had taken her own life and there'd be nothing else to investigate, case closed. Supporters of the stage theory often point out that a bottle labelled only as poison must have been mocked up as a kind of stage prop, as surely such a thing was not likely to even exist outside the confines of a cheesy horror film or a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. I mean, in the past, I feel like actual bottles of poison, like saying poison, did exist, and the poison label was on there to warn people not to drink it because it's poison. Like now we just have one of those ISO stickers on the back, being like, yo, don't eat this, with the little lungs being destroyed, or that fish pond with all the dead fish in it, or whatever those symbols are. I know we're talking about the olden days, but even so, the people of the 1930s would have been unlikely to just wander into their local store and ask for a loaf of bread, a quarter of lemon bonbons, and a large bottle of poison, please. I don't know about that. I think they could have bought poison to, like, get rid of rats and stuff. And they'd put the poison on, like, little bits of food, and they'd leave it out, the rats would eat it and die. I feel like that is not unreasonable. That's true, but back in those days, any kind of product not meant to be consumed would often have the words "not to be taken" or "poison" molded onto the glass, hidden behind the main label. The idea was that if the label fell off your bottle of rat poison or toilet cleaner or antifreeze, you would still be able to see a simple warning that the stuff inside this bottle would most definitely not go down well with a couple of Spam sandwiches. So, it's not that unreasonable to consider that the glass bottle found in the cottage may just have been one of many everyday household objects owned by Connie Kent, which had always been there and had nothing to do with the fate of the skeleton. As for the copy of Romeo and Juliet, I'm not entirely convinced that this was ever lying open on the bedside table in the first place. Whilst early news reports make reference to an open copy of the Shakespeare play on the bedside table, it was only much later reports which reached the conclusion it was definitely Romeo and Juliet, and this does appear to be some kind of effort to tie it in with a bottle of poison and potential tragedy for dramatic effect. Whilst it's often reported that the book was replaced by the bottle of poison, it could be that the glass bottle was always there, and in the meantime, someone had helped themselves to Shakespeare's book. Yeah, but not all the cash and jewelry in the house. I mean, considering the cottage was empty for 10 years, it's not inconceivable that someone else may have popped in for a quick rummage around Connie's belongings. That might even provide a clue as to the identity of the skeleton. Perhaps a homeless person or even a World War II soldier may have climbed through a window and sought refuge in the cottage, but ultimately died from natural causes in there, and the body went unnoticed for years. Yeah, I totally think that's possible. Or maybe they even poisoned themselves. Before we get too carried away with ideas along those lines, we should take a quick trip down to the town of Coggeshall in Essex, about 13 miles or 20 kilometres from the village of Fingringhoe. A perusal through the burial records of the local church reveal a pretty crucial point, which often gets overlooked in the telling of this tale. In 1949, the remains of Ada Constance Kent were buried in the Coggeshall Great Churchyard. Well, okay, so where did they find her body? It's not the skeleton. Some of the details are a little vague. The record states that her reported date of death was the 22nd of March 1949 and her age was about 77, both of which fairly accurate assessments of when the skeleton was found rather than when she would have died. But the address is clear enough. The Cottage, Whalebone Corner, Fingringhoe. Addresses in the past were so simple. No postcodes. Just like, where do you live? The house on the corner. Just put that on the envelope. It'll be fine. Why would she have been buried in Coggeshall rather than her home village? Well, that's still a bit of a mystery, although it's possible that her closest relatives may have lived there. But this doesn't seem to confirm that many of the recent online dives into this story, which insist that the skeleton belonged to somebody else, are completely false. To be fair, so were quite a few of the newspaper reports at the time. For example, the Chelmsford Chronicle reported on confirmation from the police that the skeleton was not that of Ada Constance Kent, whilst over on the other side of the world, the Sydney Morning Herald declared that the skeleton was sent to Scotland Yard, where experts discovered from superimposed photographs that it could not possibly be that of Miss Kent because neither the age nor the measurements tallied. The Essex Chronicle took a rather more restrained approach when they bothered to directly contact Scotland Yard, who revealed the identity of the skeleton had not yet been confirmed either way. It's possible that the other newspapers had spoken to a copper on the scene of the discovery who had voiced his opinion that the skeleton looked a bit too big and masculine for a mature lady. And this single off-the-cuff opinion evolved into a story, which continues to be reported as fact near 75 years later. Yeah, Danny, you led me down the garden path, because earlier on, it was like, I felt like that was confirmed. I think it's much more likely that it's her then. But any lingering doubts can be swept aside by the conclusions reached at the inquest into the death of Ada Constance Kent, held on July the 8th, 1949. Although we don't have access to all of the coroner's inquest files, the contemporary newspaper reports revealed that the county pathologist, Dr. Francis C. Camps, took the time to point out the many similarities between the skeletal remains and the description of Connie Kent, including, most notably, her slightly protruding teeth. He went on to explain how there was no evidence of injury or assault or poisoning, but it was impossible to ascertain the exact cause of death when it happened. The inquest jury agreed that the skeletal remains were those of Ada Constance Kent, which paved the way for burial at Coggeshall Church and the issue of a death certificate which listed the cause as unknown. There was certainly at least one more important point that we can glean from the press reports of the inquest, and that's the way in which Dr. Francis E. Camps displayed the bones to the inquest jury as he presented his findings. He didn't just wheel out a complete skeleton and start pointing to all the relevant bits with a walking stick. No, Dr. Camps showed off all the separate yellowing bones individually as he explained to the jury that the body had likely not decomposed and mummified in a traditional way due to the unusual weather conditions of 1939, and that in the meantime rodents appeared to have been nibbling away at the spine and ribs. Lovely. So the majority of earlier newspaper reports had got it completely wrong. We were never talking about a fully formed skeleton glaring vacantly at the police. The US paper, the South Bend Tribune, had quite bizarrely been closer to the mark when it reported police finding a collection of disconnected bones underneath the bed. And whilst they were all later identified as belonging to the same human body, no attempt was ever made to fit them back together. But whilst we can now be sure that Ada Constance Kent didn't just vanish into thin air and that an entirely different skeleton didn't just randomly appear in her cottage a little later on, there are still other parts of the jigsaw that don't yet fit together. For example, if Connie Kent had been dead all this time, then why was a dead woman still receiving substantial payments into her bank account? Oh yes. Well, maybe she was an actor, right? Maybe she's getting like... Oh, well, we don't know if she's an actor, but let's theorize. Did they get royalty payments back in the day? Like maybe, sell some DVDs of her plays and she gets paid? And if there had been no trace of her body during the original searches of the cottage, how did it find its way back into her home many years later? Where had Connie Kent been hiding for all that time? Act 5. The show must go on. It's often wondered why a perfectly good cottage had just been left abandoned for 10 years and why nobody ever stepped forward to claim it or try and buy it. Yeah, or just vandalize the shit out of it. Like, how has that not happened? We're going to have to remember that a world war was raging for the 6 years that followed Connie's disappearance and that everybody had more important things to worry about. People generally moved about quite a bit during wartime anyway for various reasons, and nobody was yet certain if Connie might still be knocking around somewhere and might still yet come back to the village to pick up another packet of Woodbines. I gotta know what Woodbines are. I'm sorry. I'm 99% sure they're cigarettes, but Danny, you've mentioned them 7 times. So now I have to know. Woodbines. Cigarette. Brilliant. British band of cigarette, which as of 2019, oh wow, it still exists! Woodbines are still a thing! Wow. Cigarette packages back in the day used to be a lot nicer looking. They were also known as woodies. But it does make you ponder just how long Connie's remains had been waiting in the cottage. It would appear that they were nowhere to be found during the original searches. Gardener George Wincall had made... I'm sorry, I called you a murderer earlier, George. I don't think you had anything to do with this anymore. It's just you randomly got introduced to the story and I was like, it's him! It's like, murder mystery, but you're like, it's him, and then it's not. He had made it clear that he'd searched every nook and cranny of the house during his second solo search in 1942, while Constable felt that the original search in 1939 had already proved conclusive. Before it was confirmed that the remains found in 1949 were those of Connie Kent, Constable had told the press, "Somebody must have died in their cottage a long time after the old lady vanished. I'm ready to swear there was no body there the day we searched." So it would seem that the remains of the body must have appeared at some point between George's last search in 1942 and the discovery by the police in 1949. And yet, the police may not actually have been the first to discover the remains of Connie Kent. There were other silent witnesses who had apparently stumbled upon the bones long before 1949, surprisingly small silent witnesses who only found their voices during the inquest. 21-year-old Derek Edward Allen admitted to the jury that as a young boy, he and a group of friends regularly broke into the cottage and treated it as a kind of secret den. There you go. I told you it's always, the youths are doing this. Of course they are. I feel like everything is right in the world again. He remembers once coming across a collection of bones underneath the bed, but didn't think much of it in the time. In his own words, "We thought they were those of an animal that a dog had gnawed." And these may not have been isolated incidents. Residents from the period recall that mucking about in the old abandoned cottage was a regular pastime for young kids. As the cottage was situated right next to the primary school, some kids even secretly sneaked in during break time. It reached the point where the headmistress of the school was growing increasingly concerned as some of the kids were talking about mysterious bones and a foul stench engulfing every room in the cottage. Well, how about headmistress? You get concerned enough to be like, "Yo, police, go around there. There's a weird smell coming from the abandoned cottage. And if you could fence it off, that'd be brilliant. Thank you." And this leads us to the alternative explanations as to why the police returned to the cottage in the first place for the 1949 investigation. It's usually reported that the bank got the police on the case as they were unsure of what to do with the account of a missing woman who was still getting substantial payments regularly deposited into her account. Why would a bank do that? The bank would just be like, "Yeah, we're just going to loan out this money," because that's what banks do. They'll be like, "I'll take that free money." Why would they comment on this? And that may well be true. Okay, it's often speculated that Connie may have been receiving royalties from her film work even after her death. There we go. Although it now seems doubtful that she ever worked in film. But she may still have been receiving regular payments from another source, perhaps from some kind of annuity or some other kind of private arrangement which involved periodic payments. A former resident who took Connie's mail whenever she was away recalled that Connie used to get particularly excited whenever she was given a letter with a crest on it, and the resident was left with the impression that such letters contained good news for Connie's bank account. If you think about it, it's maybe not that strange for a person whose death had yet to be confirmed to continue receiving regular payments. It would have been far more suspicious if somebody had actually been withdrawing money from a missing woman's account. But there are other possible catalysts for the 1949 police investigation. Some reports suggest that George Wincall called the police to secure the cottage as he was concerned over the children breaking inside to muck about. The headmistress of the school may also have expressed similar concerns, particularly as some of her pupils were complaining about the stench. But a more likely explanation is that the council asked the police to check out the cottage as they were quite keen to demolish it and couldn't do so without the owner's permission. Why would the council feel the need to demolish a perfectly nice if slightly smelly cottage though? Well, that would be for a very good reason that again usually gets missed in the more sensationalist studies into this case. At some point during the 1940s, a great big tree had fallen into the cottage roof and practically wrecked most of the building. Seems like quite an important detail. And also the kids would go in there and up even harder. While most reports suggested that the police just wandered into the cottage and came across a fully dressed skeleton lurking in the bedroom, Police Sergeant T. Waylett revealed during his testimony at the inquest that the police spent several hours clearing through the rubble of the crumbling cottage before they came across a collection of bones in what used to be the bedroom. Okay, so she could have been there the whole time, just died under the bed or whatever. And then the tree shook things up and shuffled the bones out, and that's how they got there, and they definitely weren't a fully clothed skeleton. We've established that by this point. All of this gives weight to the most likely theory that the body of Connie Kent had been there all along ever since she first went missing in 1939. I think that's extremely likely. It's possible that Connie had died in a pretty unusual and not easily accessible part of the cottage, which only yielded its secrets after the overhanging tree fell onto the roof and smashed the place to bits. For example, perhaps she had been poking around in the attic on the day she died, and her body only became visible for the first time after the attic caved in under pressure from the fallen tree. Exactly, yeah, this is all very reasonable. I think this is way most likely. However, that doesn't fit in with the idea of the kids finding what they took to be animal bones underneath the bed long before the tree came crashing down. Okay, so that was before the tree came crashing down. Okay, fine. I suspect that the body had been under the bed all along and that the gardener George Winkle and Constable weren't quite so diligent in their investigation as they had claimed. To be fair, if you're having a poke around a house to find clues to the whereabouts of a potentially missing person, you might not necessarily feel the inclination to open every drawer and to look under every chair. But I still think Constable should have bothered to check under the bed. Things may have worked out differently if Chief Inspector had been on the case. This does obviously beg the question as to how Connie died underneath the bed, but she could have potentially fallen seriously ill. She may have been suffering from hypothermia and sought comfort and warmth underneath her own bed during her final harrowing hours. Another quick point about the state of the cottage is that the empty glass bottle of poison could hardly have been found on the bedside table if the entire bedroom was just a massive pile of rubble. As we suggested before, it was more likely just a old bottle of an everyday household product which was naturally missing a label after being caught up in the devastation caused by a wonky tree and was now revealing the simple and stark warning message molded into the glass. It was probably one of many everyday items found amongst the carnage, but the word poison appeared to ignite the interest of the press far more than the cotton mop and the soap dish. Whilst it may seem a bit odd that a body was left undiscovered for 10 years in a cottage on a main village road in a very close proximity to both a school and a pub, all the clues do seem to stack up. We already know that the landlord of the Whalebone pub testified that Connie looked very ill when she popped in for a final quiet drink and a final purchase of 20 Woodbines, and 21-year-old Derek Edward Allen testified at the inquest that he had spotted bones underneath the bed after breaking into the house as a youngster. He claims that this had occurred when he was just 12 years old, which would mean that he saw the bones in the year 1940, only around a year after Connie went missing, and a full 2 years before George Winkle claimed to have performed his comprehensive second investigation in 1942. I'm starting to think George Winkle just wandered around with his eyes shut, and I'm not sure I'd have felt confident of hiring his services as a gardener. If we're being generous, we could speculate that as so many kids were apparently breaking into the cottage on a regular basis, maybe one of those kids took it upon themselves to move all the bones to a different and not easily accessible part of the cottage, which again only pushed the remains into view after the tree came crashing down on the roof. And maybe we should be a bit generous to poor old George Winkle, as his own story has a tragic end, which is not a million miles away from the conclusion of Romeo and Juliet. It's reported that George became ever more withdrawn following the verdict of the inquest. Although he probably knew Connie Kent more than most, he seemed unwilling to engage in any discussion of the topic down at the Whalebone pub, and he was often spotted wandering alone around the ruins of the cottage before the council finally got their way and completely demolished the building in 1954. Just 1 year after the demolition, George Winkle was found hanged in the downstairs room of his own cottage. And this naturally did spark a few questions. Did George know a lot more than he ever let on about the disappearance of Connie Kent? Why did he leave it for 6 months before taking an interest in the disappearance of a regular client and perhaps even a friend? Was he just racked with guilt that he didn't act sooner, or that he failed to spot the body during either of his 2 searches? Or did he take his own life for entirely unrelated reasons? We'll probably never know. Still, it would seem that, in conclusion, the mystery surrounding the curious case of the vanishing actress can be put down to speculative and contradictory press reports at the time, which much later evolved into online case studies that focused on the spooky bits and overlooked many of the hard facts, which is why this channel exists. I'm sure this channel would do a lot better. It's just like, ooh, spooky. But we're like, no, on all of that stuff, because it's not ghosts, it's not real. It's usually very boring. That's what we do here, isn't it? It's very boring. Oh god, she just died under the bed because she was sick. She crawled under there and withered away and then turned to bones because no one missed her. It may be widely reported as the story of an actress who went missing and whose fate remained unknown after a fully dressed skeleton belonging to an entirely different person magically appeared in her home 10 years later, but it's far more likely to be the story of a seamstress who died in her own home from natural causes and whose remains weren't officially discovered until 1949. But there may yet be one final scene to play out in this tale, and that will be premiered to the public very soon indeed. As of now, the only details we have of the coroner's inquest can be gleaned exclusively from the contemporary newspaper reports, but there are apparently a whole bunch of inquest files in existence which could potentially reveal a lot more about the whole case. The only problem is that they've been sealed for 75 years. I'm slightly baffled as to why documents relating to the death of a grumpy old lady need to be sealed for such an extraordinary length of time, but as the files were sealed in July 1949, this is now! That means we'll finally get to have a peek at them in July 2024, just literally a couple of months after I've completed this script. I'll keep you updated from my Twitter account if the documents reveal anything of massive interest. But in the meantime, I'm itching with anticipation to finally hear about all the details of this story that were covered up, including all the other discoveries that were made in the cottage in Fingringhoe in 1949. After all these years, we'll finally get to hear about the werewolf in the cupboard, the yeti in the stairwell, and the mermaid in the pantry. Roll on July. I think it's July in like 2 days. You might even see this. This won't even be out by the time that happens. Anyway, that's the end of the episode. Thanks for being here. Leave a review on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.